He rides a motorcycle the way no human being should be able to. Elbow scraping the tarmac, the front tire folding, the bike sliding beneath him at over 100 miles an hour, and somehow, impossibly, he saves it and keeps going. They called him the Smiling Assassin, a fearless genius who rewrote the rules of MotoGP and bent physics to his will. But this is not just the story of how Marc Marquez became one of the greatest motorcycle racers who ever lived. It is the story of how he lost almost everything, fell into a nightmare that should have ended his career, and clawed his way back to the very top. This is the fall and the rise of Marc Marquez. The story begins in a small town called Cervera in the hills of Catalonia, Spain. Marc was born in 1993 into an ordinary family, but from the moment he could ride, it was obvious he was anything but ordinary. As a child, he was utterly fearless, throwing tiny bikes around dirt tracks, falling, crashing, laughing, and getting straight back on. That dirt track instinct, the ability to control a sliding motorcycle on the edge of disaster, would later become his single greatest weapon, the thing that separated him from every rival he would ever face. He tore through the junior ranks at terrifying speed. In 2010, he won the 125cc World Championship, and in 2012, he conquered Moto2. By then, the entire paddock knew a storm was coming. The very next year, in 2013, Marquez stepped up to the premier class of MotoGP on a factory Honda, and what he did stunned the world. As a complete rookie, he took on the established giants of the sport and beat them all, becoming the youngest Premier Class world champion in history. A legend had arrived, and he was only 20 years old. What followed was one of the most dominant eras the sport had ever seen. Marquez did not just win, he won with a style that left people speechless. He hung off the bike further than anyone, dragging his elbow and even his shoulder along the ground. He saved crashes that should have been impossible, flicking out a knee or an elbow to catch the bike and carry on as if nothing had happened. On his Repsol Honda, draped in that famous orange and red, he racked up championship after championship, 6 MotoGP titles in just 7 seasons. His aggression made him box office, and it made him enemies. His battles became the defining rivalries of the era, none more explosive than his war with the legendary Valentino Rossi, which boiled over into one of the most controversial seasons in MotoGP history. Marquez did not care. He raced everyone the same way, with total commitment and zero fear, diving up the inside, banging fairings, taking risks that made the whole grandstand hold its breath. He was simply the fastest, hungriest rider on the planet, and he knew it. But that same fearlessness carried a terrible price. Marquez crashed constantly, far more than any of his rivals, because he was always riding at the absolute limit and beyond. For years he got away with it, picking himself up, dusting himself off, and winning anyway. It made him look invincible, almost superhuman. Yet every great gambler eventually meets the moment when their luck runs out. And for Marc Marquez, that moment arrived in the summer of 2020, and it nearly destroyed him. At the Spanish Grand Prix in Jerez, Marquez lost the front end at brutal speed and was flung down the track in a horrifying crash. He slammed into the ground and broke his right arm, the humerus snapping clean. It looked bad, but nobody yet understood just how bad. In the past, he had always bounced back within days. This time, the injury would drag him into the darkest chapter of his entire life, a nightmare of operations, infections, and pain that would steal years from the prime of his career. He tried to come back far too soon. Just days after surgery, against all medical advice, he attempted to race again, and the strain shattered the metal plate holding his arm together. That single decision triggered a catastrophe. He needed a second major operation, then a third. An infection set in. The bone refused to heal. The fearless champion who had conquered the world was suddenly facing the very real possibility that he might never race a motorcycle competitively again. What came next was years of agony. Marquez disappeared from the front of the field, a shadow of the rider he had been. He battled through repeated surgeries, endless rehabilitation, and crushing disappointment. At one point, he was struck by double vision, a recurrence of an old eye injury that left him questioning everything. He would return, struggle, crash, and break down. For a man who had only ever known dominance, being slow, being in pain, being beaten, was a torture far worse than any physical wound. Through all of it, he refused to quit. He underwent a fourth major operation on his arm, a drastic procedure that finally, slowly, began to give him back some of what he had lost. But the machine he was riding, the once all-conquering Honda, had fallen far behind its rivals. No matter how hard Marquez pushed, the bike simply could not win anymore. And so he faced the hardest decision of his career, to walk away from the team that had defined him and gamble everything on a fresh start. It was a stunning move. Marquez left the factory Honda squad, a partnership that had brought him 6 premier titles, and took a leap into the unknown. He climbed aboard a Ducati, the bike that had been beating him, determined to prove that the magic was still there, that the fire still burned. Critics wondered if he was finished, if the injuries had taken too much, if the fearless boy from Cervera was gone forever. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. Reunited with a winning motorcycle, Marc Marquez came roaring back to life. The elbow was back on the ground. The impossible saves returned. The hunger that had always defined him burned brighter than ever, sharpened now by everything he had suffered. He began winning again, climbing back onto podiums, fighting once more at the very front of MotoGP against a new generation of riders. The fall had been brutal, but the rise was magnificent, and it cemented his legend not just as a champion, but as a survivor. Because anyone can win when everything is perfect. What truly defines greatness is what you do when everything falls apart. Marc Marquez was a generational talent who reached the very top, then lost it all to injury and despair, and then refused, absolutely refused, to let that be the end of his story. He fought his way back from the edge of oblivion to remind the world exactly who he was. That is the fall and the rise of the smiling assassin. Thanks for watching Throttle Tales. If his story inspired you, twist the throttle on that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next ride.